Well, hey, authors, welcome back to another of our Experts for Authors live streams. Today, we are talking to an incredible gentleman. He is a father of a good friend of mine, and we're going to be talking to Dave today. Dave, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I'm a airline captain at a major airline. My background is that I started into aviation shortly after college. I was a pre-med student to begin with, and I was planning on going into medicine. I was to be the fifth generation doctor in the family, but in 1980, President Reagan was the newly elected president, and he was rebuilding the military. So I was running into a lot of college campus recruiters. And it's interesting because I look back on it and I wonder why I never considered aviation in the first place. But I, as a teenager, had model airplanes, military airplanes that I had built and hung from my ceiling. And I was fascinated with them, but I never thought of it as a career. And but I kept running into recruiters, and I was in the process of starting to make med school applications. And they said, "Hey, we really need pilots right now in the all the branches of the military." So I started looking into it a little further, and I thought this is a possibility, and it's one of those crossroad moments in your life where you think, which path do I take? And like Yogi Berra says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I took the opportunity, and we were married at the time, my wife Nikki and I, and we already had one child. And we thought this is a great adventure. And I teased my wife about having to drag her into the military, and then when we left, I had to drag her out. She loved the total experience, and it was an awesome opportunity to serve my country and also gain the skills of aviation. So I went to the Air Force, and went to pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base. After that, I followed on assignment to KC-135s at Robins Air Force Base. And then I was selected to come back to ATC as a T-38 instructor pilot. And it was a fabulous adventure for myself and for the family. And 8 years later, and 4 children later, the opportunity came to hire on with the airlines, and I fulfilled my commitment. And so I put my applications in. I thankfully got selected by the one airline that I really wanted to fly for. And in 1989, I signed on, and I've been flying for almost 32 years with an airline at this point. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It has one of the things that I reflect back on going into aviation, coming from a medical background, was that I thought, I'm a good student. I made the grades. This will probably be easy for me. And it was actually quite difficult. In fact, my wife can attest to the fact that the 1 year I spent in pilot training in the Air Force was probably the single most difficult and stressful year of my life, but it was also the most rewarding. And looking back on it, I'm glad I stuck with it, because it's been a fabulous career and a great life.
That's fantastic. And I'm so excited to have you here today. We are going to be taking questions. So if you are joining us live inside of our closed Facebook group, now is the time to start dropping your questions into the comment box. We'll be moderating this as we go, and we'll be answering your questions along the way. We're going to establish a couple things you should know before we jump into those questions. But if you are dropping those questions, please check out our caption. There's a link there that you can go ahead and click on, and that will give permission to Facebook to then show us your name, so that it doesn't just say Facebook user on screen when we pull up those questions. And if you are on a replay over on YouTube, feel free to drop your questions below, and we'll see what we can do to get those answered for you. So I want to jump in, and I want to have a conversation about some of the groundwork for your job. So can you tell us a little bit about the specifications of your job? What do people need to know about pilots? What's required of them?
Things have changed slightly since I got into aviation. One of the things was the very rigid physical requirements. Of course, you have to be healthy, and that is in a way it excludes a lot of people. And one of the things that's precarious about the physical requirements is you can lose your career at any time as well. I've known people people that develop diabetes, for example, and that immediately ends your career. You lose an eye, you lose a hand.
Yeah.
Physical things are very important to it. But looking back, when I was hired out of of course, going into the military, I had to have 20/20 vision.
Mhm.
Um, Going into the airline jobs, at that time you had to have 20/20 vision, and the airline I signed on with was the last required 20/20 vision. Now it just simply has to be correctable to 20/20. And of course, over time, they've invested enough money in you. Once you've gone through the training, if your eyes do start to go not real bad, but a little bit, if you require glasses, then they're going to want to put glasses on you rather than say, hey, your career's over. So
Right.
yes, your eyes can be correctable to 20/20 as far as that's concerned. Every It starts out that every year you have to have a physical. Once you get to a certain age, it's twice a year, and that includes EKGs and that sort of thing. So they want to make sure you're in good physical condition for the job. It helps to have a good math background. I thankfully, because of my undergraduate, I was graduated in zoology and a minor in chemistry. I had a good math background, and that comes into play in a lot of different areas of aviation, whether it's cardinal directions, navigation, that sort of thing. It's good to have the math background. Geography helps. Um, all those physical requirements, physical sciences that come into play with aviation. You have to be, I think, geared towards what they would call a type A personality. People who are indecisive or don't have quick judgment decisions, or what's the word? Um, Able to make quick decisions. It's not for them. It has to be. You have to be able to make quick decisions, things of that nature. But I don't know. I'm kind of rambling. Is there anything else that um,
No.
you have to love motion? And that eliminates a lot of people because they think aviation sounds really cool, but then they find out they get motion sick, and that's something that eliminates people from pilot training.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you, in general, how long do you have to train to be a pilot?
Well, when I went through the Air Force, it was a full year. Now the military has changed quite a bit. They talked about the program when we got into class. Of course, it's the military, and they're not real suave or um, what's the word? They're not real tactful as far as it's kind of like the train is here, get on the train or get off, but we're leaving the station. And it's that was literally the speech we got. And it was like, be prepared to assimilate information as if you are drinking from a fire hose, because that is a lot of information coming in at once, and you're having to learn um, just the basics of aeronautics as well as instrumentation in the aircraft, how to orient yourself to the instruments and things of that nature. And it was a cram course. In Air Training Command at the time, they had a saying: in Air Training Command, we only work half a day, and that meant 12 hours a day. And we worked 12 hours a day and not more than that, because by requirement we had to have 12 hours of rest between each day. But they were long days, and they could be very stressful.
Interesting. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And we've got some great questions coming in. We're going to get to those in just a minute, friends. I want to switch gears just a tiny bit, and I want to talk about what a typical day looks like for you. So, what does this look like when you are on the job?
Okay. In the airlines, and of course I'm tailoring this specifically to the airline that I fly for. A lot of people don't understand how our schedules work, and so just backing up a little bit, the month before we have what they call a bid package, and it shows us what the trips are available. A lot of misconceptions are that pilots have a route, and I get asked this all the time: what is your route? Well, we don't have a route. We have a selection of trips that we can fly, and destinations and layovers, and they may be as many as 4 or 5 legs a day, or it may be, if you're flying international, you may fly one leg. And so those are things, but we select according to what we want to fly and according to our seniority number in our category
Okay.
is how we get selected for the trips we get. So if you're at the bottom of the category, you're not going to get the best trips. If you're senior in category, you're going to get the best trips. And then they lay that out on a timeline for the month so that you can, and it all has to coordinate with rest periods that are mandated by the FAA.
Okay.
So you can't load them all up together. They're going to be spread out. And one month might look like a 2-day trip, 2 days off, a 4-day trip, 1 day off, a 3-day trip. It's a hodgepodge. And one of the things that in our schedule, a lot of people think, oh, holidays, and that's saying, well, there are no holidays. It's your schedule falls on these days. If you want that day off, you have to bid for it. And you have to put your request in for it, and it may not come to you depending on what your seniority is. But my day can vary widely. It can start out very early. It can start out very late. A lot of the pilots prefer to avoid the red eyes, which means you're flying all night. Then you sleep during the day, and you may get up and fly another leg in the evening, lay over again, and then you might fly 3 legs the next day. And we call them legs. Each flight is a leg. One of the things that's kind of interesting and that the public may not know is that the captain generally will be the first one to start the trip, as his first leg will usually go to the captain. He may or may not know the person he's flying with. It might be the first time he's met that other person. And so the captain kind of sets the tone or the way he operates. And then the next leg, it will alternate. The next leg will go to the first officer, and the captain will take over what they call the pilot monitoring duties. He'll be the one talking on the radio or talking on the PA. A lot of times when you hear a PA, you may not know if it's the first officer or the captain, because it depends on who's flying. The person who's flying will not be doing the PA or talking on the radio, and vice versa. So, so the daily schedule, when I show up at work, the first thing I do is I report in, and we've since the COVID-19 thing, we've been able to report in via our mobile devices, our phones, and things like that, and that they know what our location is if we're in the parking lot of the airport or whatever. We can report in that way. It used to be that we had to report into the pilot lounge, get on the computer, sign in, I'm here, and then and that's at least an hour prior to the first leg. Well, now I try to get to the aircraft as soon as I can because it takes a good amount of time to set up a cockpit. You have to go over the flight plan, and the flight plan, as we run it, prints out on paper, but we also get it on a mobile device. Okay. And so we will go over the flight plan. There will be things on the flight plan that will tell us if there is maintenance, what they call maintenance carryover items. For example, we have a pneumatic pack that may be what they call MCO'd. So we've only got one in it. We have to go through a book that tells us, yes, you can go with this equipment inoperative or you cannot. And then we make sure that everything's that we need is operational. And that's part of it. We have to program in our flight plan to the computer in the aircraft. And then we can get what we call a clearance. We have to go through ATC, or the Air Transportation through Tower, basically. They will tell us that you are cleared such and such, and then we make sure that we've got that all lined up. Then we brief that, yes, we've set up the cockpit, we have the flight plan. This is the pilot flying will say, this is my plan of action, and if we lose an engine, this is what we're going to do. If we have an emergency before a certain airspeed on the runway, we're going to abort. This is who is going to take over this duty and who will do what. We explain, we get that all briefed up and ready to go. And then once we've got that all squared away, we're waiting basically for the tug driver to say they're ready to go. We're waiting for the flight attendants to tell us they're ready to go. And then we call the ramp tower and we push away from the gate. So there's a lot of choreography going on before a flight that a lot of people may or may not be aware of what we're doing in the cockpit. And of course, we have the occasional passenger that wants to come up and get their picture, or their toddler, or their somebody, and we're more than happy to accommodate that. It's great fun. And another aside that's kind of interesting. I have over the years had people come up to the cockpit who have completed a fear of flying class.
Ooh.
And one of the things that they teach them is it's good to go up and talk to the people in the cockpit, because that can assuage your fears and know that there's somebody up there that's in control and able to take care of it. And so I have had a number of people stick their head in and just say, hey, I graduated from my fear of flying class. I just want to come and talk to you. And we're more than happy to accommodate them.
That's really interesting. I didn't even know that that was a thing. So writers, take note. That might be fun to write into your stories. And I know you mentioned quite a few things in your schedule. There's one I really wanted to ask about, just a very brief answer. You said that you have to enter your flight path into the system and program that all in. Is that something that's pretty quick to do, or does that actually take a couple minutes to get all that programmed in?
Well, that's a great question. I have been flying the Boeing 767 as a captain since 2005, and I flew it as a first officer before that. When I was a first officer, we used to have to manually load it all in. We take it off of a piece of paper and load all that information in. Now we have uplink capability, and we basically have to hit a few buttons, and it will uplink the whole flight plan into the computer in the aircraft, and which really saves a lot of time. It's awesome, especially if you're flying internationally. International flights used to take a lot, because we're not only programming our flight path vertically and horizontally, but we're also plugging information about what the winds are projected to be. And so that takes a lot of time. And now that it's uplinked, it really saves us a lot of time. So yeah, we have an uplink capability.
That's really a great time saver. I love that. And on a related note, I would love to talk about some of the equipment and the things that you were using as you were flying. So maybe things for the plane, or maybe before or after. What can you tell us about equipment we should be looking up and Googling to write into our stories?
Equipment on the aircraft. Let's see. And I take a lot for granted that maybe the general public doesn't know. We have two what we call MCDU units, one for the captain, one for the first officer, wherein they are able to program and gather information at the same time. We have what we call an ACARS unit, which is basically a data link. And that way we can communicate with the company or with air traffic control through data link, as well as, and there are newer things coming along all the time where we are moving more and more towards data link, even getting away from communicating on the radios. The radios that we have are there are basically three ways of communication, and maybe four. Well, data link is one of them, of course. We have VHF radios, which is very high frequency. We have HF radios, which are long distance radios. Those are a lower frequency. And then we have what is satellite com, or we call it SATCOM, but it's satellite communications, where it's literally like picking up a telephone and having a conversation on the phone. So the communications aspect of it, especially when you're going international, is a very big aspect, because you have to have certain clearances that you may not have when you take off, that you have to get further down the road. You have to be able to communicate. If you can't communicate, then you have to have a backup plan as to what you're going to do if you lose communications, and holding patterns and not continuing past a certain point, those sorts of things. Our navigation systems used to be, when I started as a first officer, were what they called ring laser gyros. And they were very accurate, but they were susceptible to some map shifts in certain areas of the world, like Moscow. And I think that's still a problem. But now that we've got GPS, our navigation is so precise and so foolproof, I guess you could call it, that we can't very, very far off track before somebody notices through our communication system if we're off track.
That's fantastic. I love that you can't stray too far before somebody calls you on that. We
Yeah.
do have some questions coming in, which we're gonna get to, but there's one I want to pull up right now. One of our viewers does want to know, because you do fly around to a lot of countries, how do you communicate with radio towers that speak different languages?
Very good question. The, the benefit of speaking English is that English is the language of aviation. They have to learn English.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
That's
that's an interesting thing because you go anywhere you go in the world, you're talking to air traffic controllers from different countries, and they are speaking English. Now, their own country, for example, if you're in France, you will hear French on the radio, but it's a French air traffic controller speaking to a French company aircraft. But everybody else, if they're speaking to a German, for example, if Paris is talking to Lufthansa, they will both be speaking English to each other. And that's the international rule for language in aviation is English. I'm sure that's something that evolved and grew up out of. For one thing, it was the United States that started manned flight, but I think more has to do probably with the political situation after World War II, and the English-speaking world seemed to dominate in the areas of aviation. So it became just kind of the agreed upon language of aviation was that everywhere you go in the world, they will be speaking English. And I've often thought that was a tremendous benefit for those who are native speakers of English, because it is difficult to get into aviation in another country where your native language is not English. That means now you've got to learn aviation and you've got to learn English.
language.
And we had foreign students in our undergraduate pilot training class in the Air Force who were from other countries, and yes, they had to learn English before they could come into the pilot training program.
Wow, I did not know that. That's really very interesting. I feel like
Yeah,
I want to do a little more research on that now. I've learned. I have learned. This is fantastic.
yeah.
I want to talk a little bit, switching gears just a touch, about what the entertainment industry gets wrong about your industry. So we see a lot of things on TV and in the movies and even in literature. So where do we get it wrong?
Well, I just wanted to. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking how would I explain it, and just reminiscing about the medical doctor. There was years ago there was a TV show on that was called Marcus Welby MD, and we loved watching it with him because he would roll his eyes when Marcus Welby, the medical doctor, got it wrong, and he always used to complain about surgery when the surgeon had his cap over the top of his ears. He says nobody wears a hat like that. So in aviation, it's the same thing. When you see the entertainment industry, you think, well, did they have somebody that they relied upon to say no, that doesn't work, or this is how we do it. But one of the things that we see that is kind of fun every now and then is seeing pilots flying with their hats on. That just doesn't happen. And in fact, you might not even see them with their ties on. You know, once the door closes, the tie may come off,
Word.
and it might be much more casual than most people are thinking. Another thing is radio communications. Um, it's hard to explain, but you can tell a bogus radio conversation when they're getting the terminology incorrect. For example, when we fly above 18,000 feet in the United States, we use a term called flight levels. We don't say I'm climbing to 20,000 feet. I'm climbing to flight level 200. So we cut two zeros off the thousand, and then we go. Usually, we're flying around flight level 300 to maybe flight level 390, but that correlates to 30,000 feet up to 39,000 feet. So you can kind of tell when they're not getting the vocabulary or the terminology correct. What are some other things? Flying through billboards? No, that you can't do that. Uh, and I remember seeing that in Con Air, thinking, well, okay, I guess that airplane did crash, but it would definitely crash if you flew through a billboard. Other things of uh, oh, Do you have any questions? Maybe that would help me along to think of some of the things I've seen in movies.
We have so many questions that came in. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to pull them up, and we're also going to grab the ones from our users and viewers over in the comments. So let's dive in and let's ask some of these. Lena had a lot of them that she sent in. We covered some of these, but she wants to know, what do you believe to be the most challenging part of your job?
The most challenging part of the job is contingency planning. One of the things that we are trained from the beginning is you have to have a backup plan for everything. And to give you just an example of that, and it may or may not make much sense to you, but challenging airports that we go into, particularly airports that are in mountainous terrain, you have to have a backup plan of, what am I going to do if I lose an engine here? What approach am I going to fly? And by the way, before we begin descent, we brief up what the approach is that we're planning on, and then we brief a backup approach if they don't give us that approach. And I just remember going into Eagle, Colorado on one trip, and Eagle is a particularly challenging place to get in and out of because there's so many what I would call gotchas that you got to watch out for. They may put you in a holding pattern at a slower airspeed, which may tempt you to drop flaps, but you can't drop flaps at a certain altitude, things of that nature. And I remember briefing 3 approaches going into Eagle, Colorado, and guess which one they gave us? The third one that we briefed, not the first, not the second, but the third, and we were ready for it. So there's a lot of contingency planning. The other thing is bad weather. What are we going to do if we have certain minimums that we can fly down to at certain airports? Have we studied enough to know what our lowest minimums are? And what are we going to do if we are unable to shoot that approach? What's our backup plan? Where's our alternate? And how we're going to handle that if we can't get in there. Another one is mechanical malfunctions. And we don't call them emergency checklists, we call them abnormal checklists, meaning the situation's abnormal, but it's not an emergency. And so maybe my flaps don't extend all the way, or one of them extends asymmetrically. What am I going to do? And we practice this in simulators, and that's one of the really marvels of modern aviation is our safety record has improved so dramatically since we brought these very realistic simulators into effect. When I started with the airline I'm with, we used to, once we qualified on a certain airplane, we used to load up a bunch of pilots in that airplane and fly just over to an auxiliary airport that didn't have much air traffic, and each of us would get our first opportunity to land that airplane. And that was kind of a qualification aspect, that you didn't want to be the first time to land that airplane with passengers on board. Well, now the simulators are so good that we get that qualification in the simulator, and the first time we actually land that airplane will be with passengers on board. But it's so much a similar experience that it's not one of those gripping moments where I'm wondering if this is going to turn out okay, you know. But that I would say that's the hardest part is having backup plans and being prepared for the unexpected.
That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of things that are kind of unexpected, Lena would also like to know what your sleep schedule looks like. So if you are doing all of these flights that you then have to bid for, how do you manage to stay healthy and get sleep and rest in between these things?
And it gets harder the older you get. To keep and your sleep schedule does get messed up, particularly going to Europe. We used to have everybody said that the formula was this: when you get in, you fly all night, you get in early in the morning, go to sleep for 3 hours, get up and just go about the day as normal, and then go to bed European time as you would normally. That works for some. It never worked for me. I always felt like a zombie after 3 hours.
Oh.
And as I've gotten older, I thought, well, I've seen this place 1,000 times. I'm just going to sleep until I feel good enough to get up. And then I may get up and feel like going back to sleep in the evening, but then end up waking up at 3 in the morning. Okay, that's fine. Our trip is going to start at 8 in the morning, so I'm up 5 hours early. Let's think of it as an afternoon flight, that sort of thing. So everybody comes up with their own their own formula. Some people take melatonin, that helps. Back when it was approved, we used to, the international crews in particular were using, oh, it's a common sleep aid. It's not approved now, and I can't even think of what it is now. But so there is some leeway with it, but of course the FAA can be very strict about what you can and cannot take. For example, for using what is a commonly known sleep aid is uh, that you see advertised over the counter is really Benadryl, and it's an antihistamine. And
Right.
the FAA says no, you cannot use that. Benadryl will make you drowsy, and it will. Probably shouldn't be using the commercial name, but it's a compound that works very well for making you drowsy. It also clears up your sinuses, but
Mhm.
that's one of those things that they don't want us using. So
Yeah.
everybody has a way of dealing with their sleep patterns, and they know what they can and can't do after a while.
Another question that Lena has is all about the fact that you do a lot of traveling as you are flying from place to place to place. So, as you're going to maybe some places that you haven't necessarily spent a ton of time, do you get to see the sights, or is it kind of a quick turnaround? Or are you kind of sequestered in a hotel? What does that look like for you? Do you get to explore?
Well, well, nowadays with coronavirus, it's kind of a sequestration. I mean, you can get out and walk around, but it has taken a lot of the fun out of the layovers. But no, that's a great question. There are those trips where you may have a 10-hour layover, but then your next layover is 18 hours. So yes, you do have time to go and see things. And when you're going internationally, it may be 24 to, I've had as long as a 96-hour layover in Paris, which is awesome.
Ooh.
Because now you can go around and see the sites and have a family member come and stay with you during that time. And so there are those opportunities to see a lot of the world. But there are a lot of the times those short layovers, you don't have much time. In fact, I've had trips where I didn't even get into my civilian clothes until maybe the third layover. But usually there's one layover in there that it gives you enough time to go out and do things and exercise and that sort of thing.
So, what I'm hearing here is I need to be related to a pilot. That's what I'm hearing here. I need to go travel.
It helps.
We had a question about your worst experience as a pilot, whether it was with the aircraft or with the passengers. Have you had any like things that we should be aware of that sometimes occasionally happen?
With the airlines or in the Air Force. Now, the Air Force, there were a number of experiences because the Air Force flying is more challenging, and you can get in those heart in the throat moments very quickly. With the airlines, I'm grateful to say there's only been a few times where I've had concern, but never really thought, what am I going to do next? You know, it was there are times dealing with passengers that can be difficult. Only on one or two occasions have I had to have passengers removed, thankfully, that were either, inebriation is one of those things where if a person gets on an aircraft that's drunk and unable, it becomes a safety issue as far as whether or not we can get that person off if we have to evacuate the aircraft. So that is one of those things we look for, and we try to catch it at the gate before they get on the airplane. Occasionally they get on and then we have to remove them. That happens. Only on a rare occasions have I seen passengers that were so disagreeable that they had to be removed. But for the most part, thankfully, we have great gate agents, great flight attendants that handle those things before. They keep me informed of what the situation is. Thankfully, usually it never rises to the level where I have to do a face-to-face with somebody, and that's only happened a couple of times in my career. So.
And it's your job to handle it should something come up?
Yes, and that's the final authority is with the captain. The captain decides this is what we're going to do. Now, generally, he doesn't make that decision in a vacuum. He will consult with corporate security, with the gate agent, with the lead flight attendant. We'll have our little huddle and decide this is the best action to take, and usually and it's basically the final decision authority falls on the captain. what am I comfortable with as far as safety concerns with this passenger. And of course, since 9/11 introduced a whole different spectrum of concerns with security. And so that has convened a few of our huddles where we worried about abnormal or aberrant behavior. One of the things that we keep in the back of our mind is, but if for is the question we ask, but if for this, would we be okay with this person? And so those are the questions that we ask ourselves, and then determine whether or not a person needs to be removed. Thankfully, I haven't had any of the security concerns come up.
That's good, and that's good to know. We are
Yeah.
having so many great questions come in. If you are joining us live, please continue to send in those questions. We're going to get as many answered as possible while we are here today. We still have questions that came in early that I want to make sure we are touching on today. So Lena would like to know, how does being a pilot affect your family and your home life? So what does this look like for the people you love?
Might be better to ask my wife. It's an adjustment, and early on, of course, the military was a good training for what we could expect. Different in the military was that I would be gone for very much longer periods of time, as opposed to the airlines. And I think that acclimatized my wife and my children both to expecting dad to be gone for certain periods of time. But when the airline job began, now it was only maybe, in my career, there have been times when I've had 9-day trips or 13-day trips, but that was rare. Usually it's 2 to 4 day trips, maybe 5-day. But usually there's plenty of time in the month. For example, my schedule usually shows about 16 days of flying, but that's all broken up. It's not all at once. And they know when dad's gone, and mom has to, she runs everything anyway. So, I mean, she's a take charge kind of person. Yeah. And so, and they know when dad's coming back or when to expect him back. And it works out fine. And in a way, it's you could say for many relationships, it actually is a strengthener. But there are some people who don't handle it well. They don't like their spouse gone even overnight somewhere. And so it depends on the temperament of the individuals involved. And I think we've made it work out pretty well for 42 years. So
I love it. And I know you actually jumped in when your children were very, very young. Did they always grow up around aircrafts?
pretty much. I remember my 2 oldest sons on our last assignment at Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma. I flew T-38s, pretty neat airplane, supersonic. It looks like a fighter type, but it's a trainer. It doesn't have any weapon stores on it, but very fast, supersonic. And one of the things that even impressed me, even when I was doing it, was watching it from the ground and watching them take off in formation. And we flew what they call fingertip formation, which is where you've only got about a 3-foot space between the aircraft as far as wind clearances. But taking off, it's quite a sight to see. And I pointed out to my younger boys, you see what those guys are doing there? That's what your dad does. And they were kind of like, yeah, okay. They weren't impressed, because they saw it every day.
Yeah.
And it was not a big deal. So
Isn't it so funny how kids are never impressed with parents?
no, they're not.
We had another great question come in. What advice would you give to someone who is wanting to be a pilot?
There are 2 ways. And of course, it depends on what stage of your life you're at. And the commercial aviation cycle is a sine wave. It goes up and down. And back in 2005, all the airlines were declaring bankruptcy, and there weren't any jobs to be had. And up until COVID-19, the industry was booming. Case in point, my son is now in commercial aviation, and his progression was seamless. He went through the commercial way, or the civilian way, I guess you call it. There's 2 ways to do it: civilian or military. Civilian or a military, you have all your training paid for, but your payback is numbers of years served in the armed forces. Right now, is my understanding, if you sign on active duty with the military, it's going to be 11 years before you are able to opt out and fulfill your commitment and opt into commercial. If you go the commercial route, it's very expensive. And so the commercial way, having seen my son go through it, is you start out with getting your private pilot license. Then you keep going to school to get your commercial, your instrument rating, your instructor rating, your instructor instrument rating. And the way he did it, I thought, was a pretty seamless and amazingly quick way, but only because the airlines were hiring so much. And so he went for about a year and a half as an instructor for like little uh, single engine prop and twin engine prop aircraft. And then when he got to 1,500 hours, he was now eligible to apply to a like a commuter airline. And so the commuter airlines, they fly small commuter jets, and he was able to get on with them right away. Well, he had about a year and a half into his um, commercial aviation experience with a major commuter airline. And that's when COVID-19 hit, and all of a sudden, all the hiring stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there are a lot of people still instructing single engine prop airplanes waiting for their opportunity, but those jobs don't pay very well. So and the investment to get your, what they call your tickets, your instrument, your commercial, all those tickets that they talk about, it can be anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 just to get that training. Plus, major airlines will want you to have a college degree.
Okay.
So all that goes into it, and a good math background is really a good idea, I think.
Okay.
Science or something of that nature.
Right.
But we do have history majors and music majors as pilots as well. So
interesting. I bet the history majors love traveling internationally.
oh, absolutely, yeah. And they'll bend your ear about history. So
I would love that. That would be so fun. We
yeah.
have another question. How many hours of flight time do you actually need to kind of advance to somebody who's in charge, being that lead pilot or the captain?
That's a good question. There are minimum numbers established by each airline, and I believe the one my son flies for is 1,000 hours before you can transition from the right, what they call the right seat, to the left seat. Okay, now the left seat is the captain. The right seat is what we call the first officer. A lot of people, that's another thing that maybe is general public doesn't know, is we call them first officers. A lot of people refer to that as the co-pilot. That's correct. Co-pilot and pilot are I guess commonly interchangeable, but the interesting thing about it is both the person in the left seat and the right seat are both pilots. And there were times when people would say, "Oh, you're not the pilot, you're the co-pilot." Well, a co-pilot's a pilot. They have all the same ratings and everything. Basically, what it boils down to is the first officer or the co-pilot is just simply waiting for his opportunity in the seniority list. He's waiting for people to retire. We joke about first officers buying the captain a motorcycle so that they can move up a number, that sort of thing. But it's really a matter of waiting for your opportunity. And if there's stagnation in the industry, you may end up being a co-pilot for a very long time. And in my own personal experience, we went through a couple of downturns when shortly after I got hired. So we don't have the position anymore, but I started out as a flight engineer. That was at the very bottom of the seniority list. And then you could progress up to first officer. But I was a first officer on a Boeing 727 for 8 years before I had an opportunity to even go to the left seat. Now, in recent times, when they had a hiring boom, we had guys within 2 or 3 years having an opportunity to go to the left seat as a captain. They'd be junior because of the seniority list, but they were still able to get to the left seat. Now, the flow can go backwards. If there is a furlough, people are laid off, and they start reducing the number of aircraft at the airline, you may see captains have to rebid and go back to the right seat.
Ooh.
As co-pilots, as first officers. There's also the opportunity of a captain on, say, a small aircraft who wants to fly international, and he says, I don't have the seniority as a captain to fly a Boeing or a jumbo aircraft as a captain, but I can do it as a first officer. So they may actually bid off of a captain's position on a smaller aircraft to the first officer position on a bigger aircraft. So there is a back and forth flow to it.
Interesting. Okay, I love.
I have seen guys who like to fly international stay in the first officer seat well beyond the time that they could have gone to the captain's seat.
Well, I mean, if you get
just simply because, it's a quality of life issue also, because if you're very senior in the right seat, you get to pick your schedule. If you're very junior in the left seat, you don't. So that's how we look at it.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. This is very valuable information. I love this conversation. And I actually want to jump into a bit of a lightning round because, wow, the questions have come in from our viewing audience and we're getting to the end of our time. So let's do a lightning round and see how many of these we can get answered. One of our viewers wants to know if a bullet hole in the cabin will actually suck everything out like you see in the movies.
That's the first thing I thought of about entertainment, and we all think of Goldfinger, don't we? You know, James Bond. No, and let me very quickly. In every aircraft, we have what we call an outflow valve, and it's about as big a hole in the side of the aircraft as a basketball, or about that wide. And what it does is it has a louvered door that will close to regulate the pressurization of the cabin. If you put a bullet hole through the side of the aircraft, you're going to have just one extra small leak, and that door may close a fraction just to maintain pressurization in the aircraft. If you were to blow out a window, it would be very disruptive in the cabin if you had a hole this big. But the aircraft is still capable of maintaining pressurization, although there would be a lot of airflow going right across that row of seats and probably sucking things out with it, but probably not people. It would be disruptive, but a single bullet hole would not do anything, really.
Okay. That makes sense. I love it. Tell us a little bit about the relationship between the flight crew in the cockpit with the flight attendants and the gate attendants.
When we report to work, first thing we do is we come to the gate and we talk to the gate agent about the flight, get the flight plan. The gate agent will inform the flight crew if there's any particular special needs or concerns about this particular flight. And then we introduce ourselves. Quite often we will see the flight attendants and the cockpit crew will see each other at the gate and may introduce themselves there, or we may find the flight attendants already on the aircraft when we show up and introduce ourselves then, and vice versa. They may show up later than we do. The captain has to brief the lead flight attendant, and it's a good idea if he also briefs the whole crew together before each flight. And usually it's boilerplate stuff like, this is how long the flight is, this is what the standard procedure is. When we get above a certain altitude, I'll notify you. If we have an emergency, this is what we'll do to inform you how much time we've got, how much time it's going to be before we're on the ground. We have certain codes that we give each other. If we tell the cabin crew to anticipate if they're going to evacuate or if they're not going to evacuate in an emergency situation, things of that nature. If there are cabin discrepancies, seat 5B has a TV screen that doesn't work. Okay, I've got to brief them on that so that they know if we can keep somebody out of that seat, or if somebody's going to sit there, they need to know that that's certain creature comforts that aren't working. So, but typically, usually we're introduced to the cabin and the flight crew, or the cockpit crew are usually on the airplane when we meet each other, and we just exchange names and crew positions and things of that nature.
Do you frequently fly with the same people, or is it pretty different for every flight? Do you see some of the same faces multiple times?
It's interesting. When you're flying international, you will see a lot of the same faces, and you will actually do a lot more together as a crew, even on your layovers. Now, when you're flying domestically, and this is the airline that I fly with now, I know that the airline my son flies with, The cabin and cockpit crew are pretty much together the whole trip. But on what I'm doing when I fly domestically is we will fly from say Salt Lake to Atlanta, and the cabin crew that was with us will get off and go to a different airplane, and we may take on another cabin crew and fly to Boston, and then we'll get off and they'll go on with a different cockpit crew. So it's quite often that we are flying with people we haven't met. And if the smaller your domicile is, the more you'll get to know the people who are at that domicile. But if it's a big domicile, it's not very often that you're going to fly very often with the same people.
That makes sense. That makes sense. We've got a really good question. I definitely want the answer to this. This sounds a little bit of a conspiracy theory, and I love it. Is it true that pilots have to eat all different meals in flight just in case one of you gets food poisoning?
That is actually, I don't know how to put this. Yes, that is true. How closely is it abided by depends on. Our food's pretty safe, so
Yeah.
but I would say that is one of the things that we're counseled to do. It's a good idea to not partake of the same food, particularly if you're coming from a foreign destination where it's questionable how good the food is, or that sort of thing. But yes, that actually is, I think, one of the things we're counseled to do.
Fantastic. One of our viewers would like to know the biggest differences between flying domestic and international.
Oh, that's a really good question. Domestically, you become very comfortable with the procedures that your country uses as far as what we call transition altitudes, transition levels, where you set barometric pressure. Every country has a slightly different approach to things, and we do have all that information listed in we carry a tablet now, which contains all the information that we had in volumes of books that we used to carry before, and a lot of it requires some study as to what is the procedures in this country and what we need to follow. And in fact, it will change from airport to airport, even domestically. There are certain little things that you have to know about that particular airport. So we are constantly studying about an hour before we make our approach. We're looking at the books, looking at company pages, look at approach pages, things of that nature to find the little gotchas, even right down to taxiing into certain gates, and whether or not they want you to keep both engines running going into this gate as opposed to not. So, but internationally, we have special qualification procedures, and they send us with a what we call a line check airman to make sure we're checked out to go internationally, because there are so many different procedures when you're particularly going to Europe. I mean, I could list them all, but it's what you find out about aviation is you learn a lot about sequencing and anticipating what's coming next. What do I need to prepare for next? Do I need a clearance before I enter the North Atlantic track system? And when do I need that clearance? And what do I do if I don't have that clearance? Those kinds of things. So yes, international runs by a largely different set of rules, but once you get that into your repertoire and you get comfortable with it, it's simple. And a lot of times people think that domestic flying is easier, when in fact domestic flying may mean that you're up and you're down very quickly, and that means the pace of things goes much quicker also. So I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but yes, there's quite a bit of difference between international and domestic flying.
It's very interesting. And we actually have another question. This one is going to make you make a choice. We would like to know, is it going to be easier to do an emergency landing in water or on land?
Well, on land, if you have a runway, it's easier. The question is if you're landing out in the desert. But we have procedures for both, and one of them is that if you're landing on land, you're going to drop the landing gear regardless. If you're landing on water, you're not. And that would be the difference. Now, considering that we have actually, since Captain Sullenberger landed on the Hudson River, we have practiced this in the simulator.
Okay.
And it's kind of interesting. I don't know how realistic the simulator is for landing on water, but we did actually practice landing in San Francisco Bay, and
Really?
that was interesting. And it does make you think a lot about um, the being out of the normal situation, what kind of flap settings you might use, how close you are to the water. Of course, getting the cabin prepared, and trying to pick a direction that is conducive to landing on water. Um, that is very different. But what would be easier if I had to land on a glacier in Greenland as opposed to landing on the water? I think I'd pick the water. Um,
I
but it's a hard. It's funny because it's an interesting question, because we do on these international flights look out down at flying over Greenland or Iceland or the North Atlantic, and we think, what would I do if I lost power on both engines here? And you muse about that, and you think, I think I could do it this way, but you never really know until it happens. And that's why I applaud Captain Sullenberger. That was a very quick decision he had to make, and it all worked out very well. And it could have been much worse.
For sure. Speaking of things that could potentially be worse or maybe not worse, how much of a threat to planes are birds in the air? Because I know TV shows love to tell us it's a big deal. Is it a big deal?
It is a big deal. I have hit a few birds in my career. Usually they are inconsequential as what they do to the aircraft. Um, I did have on final approach going into Salt Lake one time. I had a seagull hit me square in front of me on the windscreen,
Mhm.
and you talk about a big blood splotch. I mean, it just covered the windscreen, and it was very shocking because it was so sudden, and it sounded like a shotgun blast, and
Oh,
even
God.
people in the back heard it. But
Oh,
they can take the public can take confidence in the strength of these aircraft that we're flying. Even when you hit big birds, they handle the damage pretty well. And in fact, this didn't even damage the aircraft. It did kill the bird, unfortunately, but
yeah.
um, we landed without any concerns. Of course, we have to write that up, and the maintenance people have to go over it with a fine tooth comb to make sure there isn't any damage. But it does happen from time to time. Going into Minneapolis, I've hit birds and at nighttime, and they said, "Well, where did it fall?" And I said, "I don't know. It's the ground." So, oh, really? Do you expect me to know where it fell? I don't know.
The exact longitude, location, we've got it
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
That actually brings me to a really good question. Just generally speaking, how much paperwork do you have to do? Is there a lot? Is it a little? Is it before and after every flight? Is it, a couple times a month? What does that look like paperwork wise?
Paperwork wise, we're moving more and more towards a paperless operation, and in some of the airlines, like the one my son flies for, has already gone paperless, which means now we've got the tablet that uploads and downloads and does all that stuff for us. And as far as paperwork, basically the only thing that we have to do paper wise is sign a release that says we're fit to fly, and that goes on record. That can be done digitally with other airlines, I'm sure. Um, Paperwork piles up usually when something is abnormal. If you have a wind shear event where you've had to perform a certain procedure, if you've had a mechanical malfunction, if you've made an error in navigation, that's when the paperwork piles up, and then you have to kind of tell on yourself. Um, this is the error I made. This is what I should have done to mitigate it, and I'm sorry. And usually they'll have a board that will review that and say, okay, well, don't do it again. Or they may not say anything. But and that's actually a very good program, because when the pilots are willing to fess up, they can tabulate and see where the weaknesses are, and they can train against those mitigating problems. Um, but as far as if everything goes normal, the paperwork is minimal. It's
Okay.
basically signing a release, and that's about it.
Interesting. So, as someone who does not fly nearly as much as you, I have experienced flights with turbulence and without turbulence. So, for my own personal knowledge, I want to know, what does this look like for you? Do you get a lot of turbulence? Do you feel like it's more spaced out? You don't get it quite as often, and we just kind of feel like sometimes it happens quite a bit. Is it a lot for you or a little?
Well, it's a lot, and it's particularly uh, particularly the time of year makes the difference. Wintertime will experience a lot more turbulence. The jet stream comes a little further south. You do get a lot of very strong headwinds and tailwinds during the wintertime, at least in the continental U.S. I should qualify that. So you will see more turbulence probably in the wintertime than the summertime. But then in the summertime, you have convective activity with thunderstorms, which we avoid. But there are always those areas where you're still going to experience some of the blow off from a thunderstorm that gives you turbulence. We have certain gradations that we quantify or qualify in turbulence. We talk about light turbulence, light chop, light turbulence, moderate chop, moderate turbulence, and then there's severe. I think in my career I've only seen severe once, and that's jarring, and it's actually very disconcerting because um, it's where you actually begin to worry about the integrity of the aircraft, but that's rare. It's very rare. And usually we're talking to each other all the time through air traffic control where the turbulence is and how to avoid it. Sometimes there are no altitudes that are smooth, and we're talking to air traffic control saying, hey, where can we get a higher or lower altitude? And they may say they're all about the same right now, or they may say, hey, they're getting a pretty smooth ride up at 390 as opposed to 310. So, and then depending on your weight will determine whether or not you can get there. If you're too heavy to get up to 39,000 feet, you may have to just ride it out. So those are some of the things that come into play. But we try to keep keep a heads up of when to anticipate turbulence and just from reports of other pilots that have been in the other. We have a great program on our computer pad that tells us it takes reports from other aircraft digitally and actually sends it so that we know where to anticipate it much better now than we used to.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's like my Waze app. It tells me where the issues are while I'm driving.
It's very much like that. Yeah, very
I
much.
love that. That's very smart. Okay. Very good. We have a couple more questions I do want to get to before we say goodbye today. So one of our viewers does want to know, is there any good or important flight terminology that we should know to be using in a stories? They'll Google it after the fact, but any like keywords we should be aware of?
Oh, definitions. Um, well, we talked about flight levels. That's one thing and that's above 18,000 feet. Um, let me think. And oh, that's a good one. I can't think
We'll come
off
back
the
to
top
it.
of my head. Yeah, come back to that one.
No worries. There's a really good question I had not thought of at all, and I really want the answer to this. What kind of facial hair is allowed, and why don't we see pilots with full beards?
Good question. One of the reasons why, and it might be more company policy than FAA, and I'm not entirely sure, but one of the reasons that we're given for not wearing beards is if we are in a situation where we have to pull the oxygen mask out, and
Oh,
that's rare. But if we put an oxygen mask on, and our oxygen masks are different from what the passengers have, these are positive seal pressured oxygen masks. They have to be able to seal
okay.
around the face. And so they don't want something that leaks. Now, I've also heard that that may be more company policy than FAA policy.
Okay.
But the other thing is the company probably wants us to groom better than that. I don't know. But as long as I've been employed, beards have not been allowed.
Okay.
Um, and that's the reason that's given to us is for oxygen mask seal.
That makes a lot of sense. I love it. Our questions are taking a little bit of a turn. We're going a little more to the murder mystery writers. People would like to know, what do you do if somebody dies mid-flight?
Um, because of the communication equipment we have, we can contact our dispatcher. We can even contact a medical hospital that is specifically designated to call when we have medical problems and concerns. And typically, we will divert in that situation. We will land at the nearest suitable airport, and we will consult with the dispatcher and the company as far as where they think the best place is for us to take that. And in order to declare somebody dead, you really have to have somebody qualified to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person may be in distress, but not dead, and people think they're dead. And so we have to take it very seriously. And I have diverted on a few occasions for medical emergencies. So yes, that would be the thing that we would do, is we would end up diverting. Now, it's something that's interesting, is that we always look for qualified medical personnel on the aircraft, but the final say when it comes to medical problems is the university medical school that we call. And we will say, well, the person in back is saying this. What do you think? And they will say, no, continue. And I've had that happen. And I think sometimes the medical person in back wants us to land because they're concerned about their own personal liability. Like, oh, well, I told him to land, and liability issues come into play here.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to go to the nation. The final authorization rests upon the captain, but he's typically going to go by the university medical professionals that he's talking to.
Okay. Okay. We had another question that's kind of a follow-up to that about a heart attack on the flight. Is that any different, or is that pretty much get a hold of the people who know what they're talking about medically and handle it that way?
Yeah, if you've got a heart attack, the first responders are going to be the flight attendants, and then they're going to call for medical personnel to help. They're going to gather as much information as they can to get it to the captain. The captain has the ability, and we have the ability now, to patch the flight attendants. It used to be that they had to write out a big form and give it to us, and then we had to try and communicate as a third person to somebody on the ground. Well, now we have the capability of actually giving them a headset and back. They plug into a communication link, and we listen in on the conversation, but they're actually talking to the flight attendants at the university hospital. And that works out quite well. It helps as far as time delays and that sort of thing. They get more immediate communication back and forth that way, and feedback. And then they can also talk directly to a medical professional who might be a passenger. That works out much better. They have a doctor or a registered nurse that can take over the situation and talk the same language with each other. So yeah, that works out very well. But if it's a heart attack, usually, and that has happened to me, we're usually looking for the next place to divert and get them to professional medical attention as soon as possible.
That makes a lot of sense. We do have a question that I don't quite understand, but I know you know the answer to this. So what is a chemtrail?
I love this question. Okay, there are contrails and there are chemtrails. This is one of my favorite soapbox. Contrails are what we see in the sky that is jet exhaust coming off the engines, that has to be the right environmental conditions as far as temperature and humidity. But what you've got is expanding gases, heat exhaust gases, going from a very hot environment into a very cold environment and a moist environment. So that's creating condensation behind the aircraft, and quite often that's why you'll see there might be a little bit of gap between the engines and where you first see the contrail. Now, it's called a contrail, and they've been around since aviation became more advanced, say around World War II. Because if you look at file footage of bombers, some of the prop bombers that they had in World War II, you will see contrails because of the conditions they're in. Now, you don't see them all the time because the environmental conditions may not be just right to get that condensation behind the aircraft. We have had conversations with people who are convinced, and my sister being one of them, that we're spraying something. And I've said, look, if we were spraying something, I would know about it. I know, and not only would I know about it, but the ground personnel would know about it. There are so many people that would know about it that there's no way that you could get something done like that without and keep it a secret. There just aren't that many people that would be that tight-lipped about it. Not only that, but there would be that many people that would be concerned about it, even participating in such a program. So yeah, there are no such thing as chemtrails unless you're talking about a crop duster. Chemtrail. We've had pilots joke about it. Usually in military units, have made up placards that said chemtrail switch, and they put it up on a switch and take a picture of it. If you see that on the internet, it's bogus. Okay, it's a joke. So yeah, there are no chemtrails as far as I know.
That is hilarious. I love that we asked that question. Fantastic job. Friends, thank you so much for joining us today. You brought the great questions. Is there anything else you feel that we writers need to know before we jump into writing our next novel and writing about being a pilot?
You know, those were all great questions. I'm sure there are people who post things on YouTube who are commercial pilots, and I've watched a few of them, and they're very good. They're very good at pointing out the little things, a lot of things that we take for granted, that the general population or public wouldn't know about. And I can't name who they are, but I know there are some out there that do a very good job, particularly of people who review movies on aviation and then point out this is where they got it wrong. And I think Hollywood in many respects is doing a better job of doing their homework. But in order to make the story interesting, you do have to introduce some things like Goldfinger, where they shoot a hole through the window and it sucks the bad guy out. It's entertaining. It's not very realistic.
I love it. I love the things that entertainment has done for the sake of being entertaining. Fantastic. Dave, thank you so much for spending this evening with us. I really appreciate all of your wonderful answers and insight into the world of being an airline captain. We truly appreciate all of your effort and time this evening. And friends, make sure you stay tuned and bring your author friends over to the group. You can hang out with us at experts.kmrobinsonbooks.com. It'll kick you over to our closed Facebook group. We have an aquatics expert. We've got a martial arts expert. We've got a lawyer coming up in this month. And I am so excited to introduce you to these experts. We've got some really cool people coming in the month beyond in March. And if you are an expert or you want a specific expert, let us know in the comments below, because I am taking note and getting fantastic people just like Dave to come and answer all of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I cannot wait to have you back for a follow-up one of these days.
Thank you, Cam. It's my pleasure.
All right. We hope you all have a fantastic evening. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not for more, and we'll see you in our next expert interview.